Alrighty, welcome back. Sorry that ended a little abruptly. So let me just kind of continue in this. I'm going to hide myself here so you can see better. Alright, so last thing we were talking about how incoming and outgoing information are both found in nerves, right? It's only once we actually get close to the spinal cord that they'll separate. You'll have incoming information from sensory neurons basically go back into what's known as this dorsal root ganglion. You'll see this in lab on models. There's this enlargement, a swelling, if you will, on this dorsal root. That basically is that swelling is due to the cell bodies of sensory neurons. So that's where their cell bodies are. So dendrites are coming in this way. Again, here's the cell body of that neuron, and then the axons are continuing on into the spinal cord itself. Okay. We don't see that same thing in the anterior root simply because the cell bodies of these neurons are somewhere else in the spinal cord, either here in one of the gray columns, or I'm sorry, gray horns, or up in the brain itself. Okay. All right. So when we take a look at the gray matter of the spinal cord, it's gray because it doesn't have any of the myelin. So things that do not contain myelin are neuronal cell bodies, axons that are unmyelinated, and dendrites never have myelin in them. So in this butterfly-shaped region, these are all gray matter, so it's one of those three things. Now, their names, for some reason, they call them horns. Okay, so, and they just tell you where it is. It's either in the front, the back, or on the sides, right? So you have anterior gray horn, you have a posterior gray horn, you can even have lateral gray horns, right? And so you see these in the thoracic spinal cord area. Again, this is going to be for sensory input coming from into that thoracic region. Okay. And crossing over from one side to the other is something called the gray commissure. And if you remember about commissures, so some information is going from the right side over to the left side and vice versa. Okay. And in this image, you'll see that central canal. It has cerebrospinal fluid in it, and it's continuous with the fourth ventricle of the brain. Okay. So the white matter is now divided into columns for some reason. And again, they're very similarly named. In the front, they're simply anterior white columns. On the side, they're called lateral white columns. And in the back, they're called posterior white columns. Okay, so you can see each column will contain distinct bundles of nerve axons, and these have a common origin or destination, so they carry similar information. Okay, we call those tracts. Right, as soon as we get into the central nervous system, we stop calling them nerves. We call them tracts. Okay. So again, the spinal cord is going to be a highway for incoming and outgoing information. And then that gray matter, again, that's where cell bodies are going to be. So it's going to receive and integrate incoming and outgoing information. We'll see that a little bit better in a second. Okay. So as I mentioned to you, sensory information is going to go up. So it ascends, goes up toward the brain, and then motor is descending because it's going from the brain down somewhere else, right? So it's going to conduct information down the cord. So sensory tracts are here in the posterior columns, and they're on both sides. They've just highlighted the sensory ones on this right side and the red ones on the left side here. So you can see here the posterior columns, and you can see all these different columns in the different areas that you see sensory tracts. And then here you can see the motor tracts in red. Now, don't worry, on a lecture exam, and even on a practical, you will not see an image like this, and you will not have to label anything. Okay, this just gives you an idea of, right about where they are located in these white columns. Come on, slide. All right. So the functions of these spinal tracts, right? So again, they're going to relay information from sensory receptors to areas in the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, right? So these are going to be the sensory receptors. That's what they're doing. Okay. And we have three different neurons that you're usually going to find in this pathway. So we have what are known as first order neurons, second order neurons, and then third order neurons. Okay. So first order neurons are basically the first ones to encounter whatever the sensation is. So that's going to go from the receptor, and it'll either make it to the brain stem or to the spinal cord. It just depends on where it'll contact the second neuron in the sort of line. The second order ones, so the first order ones may contact the second order neurons. So they either go from the brain stem or the spinal cord, depending on where the first ones ended, and they'll go to the thalamus. Remember the last lecture we talked about the thalamus as being a major relay station? Okay, so this information is going to go, again, depending on where it stopped, either from the brainstem or the spinal cord, and it'll go to the thalamus. So all the sensory information is going there. And there it will decussate. So somewhere in the second order neuron, there's going to be a crossing over. Okay, so just like we talked about motor neurons, right side of the brain controls left side of the body, same idea here. And then from that thalamus, the third order neurons are going to go to the primary somatosensory area in the cortex. Okay, so again, so first order neurons are going to go from wherever the sensation was to brainstem spinal cord. They will make contact with second order neurons, which end up in the thalamus, and somewhere along the way they'll cross over. And then from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area in the cortex, we have third order neurons. Okay. So one of these tracts is what's known as a spinal thalamic tract. And you kind of get this idea that it is an ascending pathway because it's going from the spine basically to the thalamus, so you know it's going up. It's going up toward the brain. So if you just take a look at it, here's our first order neuron here in this darker blue. It makes contact with our second order neuron in the spinal cord. It will cross over. This second order neuron goes all the way up to the thalamus, where it makes contact with these green neurons, or third order neurons, which then take that information to the primary somatosensory area in the cortex. Okay. And the spinal thalamic tract sends very specific information about pain, temperature, deep pressure, tickle, itch, food, touch, from your limbs, from your arms and legs, from your trunk, so your torso, front and back, neck, and the back side of your head. So basically everything except for your face. This is telling you about pain, temperature, deep touch, deep pressure, tickle, itch, food, touch. Again, from everything essentially except your face. Right? Another one, or another two I should say, are called the cuneate fasciculus and then the gracile fasciculus. And these are in that posterior column. So the two medial ones are the gracile fasciculi, and then the cuneate fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus on the left and right side. So these are going to give you information about touch, pressure, vibration, proprioception, and the cuneate is going to tell you from the upper limbs, upper trunk, neck, and the back of your head. The gracile fasciculus is going to tell you information about touch, pressure, oh, two S's, vibration from the lower limbs and the lower trunk. So gracile is essentially the same, they're telling you the same information, lower part of the body, upper part of the body. And come on, slide. There you go. And then the last tract is something called the trigeminal thalamic pathway. You probably remember the trigeminal nerve, right, from lab. So this is going to give you all that information that we didn't cover in the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, teeth. Okay, you don't really have proprioception because where's your nose going? It's not moving anywhere, right? So you don't have that one. But basically all that information, remember we covered everything except for our face. So this trigeminal thalamic pathway is going to give us information about our stuff in our face. But we still have that same setup. First order neuron makes contact with the second order neuron, which goes up to the thalamus, to a third order neuron, to that primary somatosensory area. Now, if you remember back to the brain lecture, I brought up the concept of a homunculus. This is a homunculus. Okay, so if you take a look at this, so here's your brain, right? And you can see there's a frontal plane through the postcentral gyrus, and so we've taken a coronal section or a frontal section of your brain. And so basically you can lay out a body on that gyrus, and so that's the homunculus, right? So basically, if I took a little electrode and I zapped this part of your brain, you'd say, oh, I feel that in my hip. If I moved over, it's in the trunk. If I over neck, head, shoulder, arm, right? And the relative size that you see here shows you how much of that area is actually taken up as is being represented by those body parts, right? So in other words, you have a lot of representation on your fingers. There's really not that much sensory information coming in about your elbow, okay? Things like that. So that's what I mean by relative size of the cortical areas are proportional to number of receptors and the sensitivity of each body part. Okay? It's not set in stone, so you can see it's modified with learning. Okay? So people who have learned to read Braille, they'll have larger areas representing the fingertips than people who haven't learned Braille, for example. Right? And so here, if we took, this is basically how that somatosensory area thinks you look. So again, this is a homunculus. So it thinks that if it could make a little drawing of how it sees you, you have a lot of space being represented by your hands, your mouth, tongue, ears, eyes, which makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of information. And then less so by your arms, torso, legs. Okay? I mean, there's a reason why you read Braille with your fingertips and not your elbow. Right? All right. So those we had talked about were the sensory tracts. So now we're going to talk about the motor tracts. So now instead of coming from some body part up to the brain, we're going from the brain down to a muscle. Excuse me. So we'll see that we have direct pathways and then indirect pathways. So our direct pathways are going to give us precise voluntary movements. Okay. So you'll see that you have different sort of subtracts. You don't necessarily need to worry about these, but you can kind of see it's split up, and these lateral and anterior cortical spinal tracts will send information about limbs and trunk, and then what's something called the cortical bulbar tract will conduct impulses for muscles in the head. Right. Indirect pathways are now not so much precise voluntary movements, but more automatic movements, things you don't think about: posture, muscle tone, equilibrium, the coordination of your visual reflexes, right? So you see something, can you catch a ball if it's thrown at you? Right? Things like that. Again, in this primary motor cortex, you have a homunculus. So now this is in this as a coronal or frontal section through this precentral gyrus. And again, we see this homunculus, very similar layout. So in this case, if I zapped this area, your middle finger would twitch. If I moved the electrode over your ring and I zapped, your ring finger would itch. And in fact, doctors know about this. Neurosurgeons know about both of these homunculi, right? Both in the somatosensory part of the brain as well as the motor cortex. So sometimes when they're doing brain surgery, the patient's often awake, and they zap these areas, and they'll say, like, where do you feel that, for example? And they'll say, like, oh, I feel it in my finger. So then they know that they're in that somatosensory area. And then if they zap them, they move over and they zap them, and the person's finger twitches, they're like, oh, okay, they know exactly where they are. Right? So theoretically, I suppose, you could implant electrodes in someone's body and control their movements, which is a little scary to think about. And as an aside, total aside, they've done this with, those big roaches that you can get like at pet stores, which is mind-boggling to me why you would want a roach as a pet, but whatever. They've taken those, and they have actually done that. They've put little implants into their little roach brains, and so roach is running, and they zap it, and the roach, it's basically like a remote control car. It's like a remote control roach. They can make it go left, right, forward, backward, which, who doesn't want one of those, right? Remind me, I'll show you guys a video in lab. Anyway, so you can kind of see here that you actually have a good chunk of your brain. If you take a look at this image, a good chunk of your brain deals with vocalization, right? So that's you making sounds. And we do have quite a complex range of sounds that we can make. We can sing, some of us better than others. We have high-pitched sounds, low-pitched sounds, loud sounds, soft sounds. I mean, think about how you sound when you're talking to someone that you like versus someone you don't like versus like your mom, right? Like, oh, mom, right? You get that higher pitch in your voice, right? So anyway, lots of brain region dedicated to vocalization. And again, if we had a homunculus, this is the way that that motor cortex of your brain thinks you look, because you have a good chunk of it going towards your fingers. We had talked about this, right? You're going to have, your fingers are very important in fine motor skills, so you're going to have a good chunk of your brain dedicated to that, and then as well as vocalizations. Not so much arms, not so much legs. All right. How are we doing? Pretty good? Not too bad? All right, I'll stop this recording here. It's a pretty good place to stop. And, as always, let me know if you have any questions. All right, until next time.